All right. Thank you, everybody, for patiently waiting for a few minutes while we got people admitted today. Appreciate you all joining us. Hopefully today will be informative, ease some of the anxiety related to this general order topic. There's a lot of discussions that have been happening, and we want to provide you guys with information and resources to be able to sort our way through implementation of this order. Even though there's been a lot of work done on it, there's still hopefully everybody can hear me now. I don't know if I unmuted at all, but welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. There's a lot of talk in the industry in regards to the general order, and we're hoping this provides you with more information, tools, resources to be able to address how you become enrolled and what implications there might be for your facility. Not great timing for the industry. We have COVID still out there. We have I'm muted again. Sorry. Wildfires out there. And so I know that this has presented a lot of financial hardship on the industry. So as far as we know, the state has not provided any concessions. There is flexibility in regards to timing. So we'll do what we can to help kind of pace things in regards to what this looks like in terms of capital costs for any implementation or improvements you need to make. So before we kind of get into the details, going over some ground rules. Again, everybody's probably used to Zoom ground rules by now, but just to reiterate quickly, if you have questions, please either email Jason Flowers directly or send him a message in the chat room. We will be looking at questions that are populated in the chat room. For tech support, we have Josh and Kat on the line as well to help with any issues. I'm technologically not quite savvy, so inevitably there will be some issue that I will need help with. So bear with me. And the presentation will be recorded, so we can share that with everybody as a follow-up. So just to go over, where are things at? This has been an order that's been the state's been working on for a while. They issued a draft order back in July, if you recall. We hosted a webinar or people provided public comments throughout July and August, but we also hosted a webinar to go over what that draft order looked like. And a lot of you attended. Thank you for that. The state issued a revised draft order in early December. Sort of bad timing. It's around the holidays. I'm not sure how many people were able to read that in depth, but there were a lot of changes. They incorporated a lot of comments from industry, the Wine Institute. There was a lot of flexibility they were trying to incorporate into the order because every facility is different. California is vastly different. There are different soil conditions, climate conditions, and they were trying to make, add some flexibility for those different conditions. Back a few weeks ago, the general order was officially adopted. It was unanimously approved. There were a lot of comments during the hearing, but they did adopt it. They made a few last minute changes, but nothing drastic in my opinion. So that is where things stand. It's officially adopted and they will start enrollment imminently. So to follow up, the general order sets requirements for what the wastewater discharge regulations are. Tied to that will be fees, and fees are going to be based on your threat to water quality and what tier you're placed in, which we'll get into in a little bit. But the fee stakeholder meeting with the state is scheduled for March 9th from 9 to 11. It's public, and so you should be able to participate or follow up and see what the results are of that meeting. But we won't know what the fees are for this order until that meeting and the fees are approved. So how do you enroll in this general order? So a notice of intent application and technical report need to be submitted to the state, and they are generally due within 3 years from the date of adoption. So from January 20, 2021. Once you submit your NOI, the state reviews, issues you a notice of applicability, tells you what tier you're enrolled in, and then compliance, or the amount of time you have to come into compliance and make any improvements, do the monitoring, is generally required for existing facilities within 5 years of notice of applicability. New facilities will be required to be in compliance before they begin operations or discharge of waste. Presentation overview. What I'd like to do, because we did go into detail on the draft order at our last webinar, I want to talk more about what the changes are since the July draft, the changes that were presented in the December draft, and the subsequent changes before the hearing. So as I was saying, most of you are probably familiar with some of these acronyms. If not, don't worry about it. We can have a follow-up conversation. Not trying to complicate the matter, but using the acronym is oftentimes a lot easier than saying the entire, all of the words involved. Okay, so tier structure. There were some modifications to the tier structure, and what they called previously as de minimis is now considered exempt. If your facility is considered to be exempt, you do not need to apply for enrollment in the general order. So what facilities qualify for exempt status? That would be a facility that produces less than or equal to 10,000 gallons of processed wastewater per year. What is processed wastewater? The state is considering processed wastewater to be any wastewater associated with winemaking process that's collected and sent to your processed wastewater system. That can be inclusive of stormwater that is also collected and sent to your wastewater system. So it's a combination of any water, wastewater that is collected and sent to the wastewater system. In this table, we've provided the equivalent wine production, cases of wine equivalent, just to give you some kind of bearings, because a lot of facilities talk in terms of gallons of wine produced or cases of wine produced and don't necessarily know what their annual processed wastewater volume is. So this is just to provide you with some quick references, but every facility is going to be different. So one thing we're talking with clients about is adding flow meters, so you know how much wastewater you're actually sending to your wastewater system, that you know what that data looks like, because the state, especially for the higher tier facilities, they're going to be looking for actual data versus theoretical data. And it's always more accurate. Oftentimes the theoretical data can overestimate what your actual process waste volumes are going to be. So I'm encouraging all facilities, if they can, to install flow meters. And if you need assistance with where to locate that flow meter, please ask us. So then looking at the other changes, there are 4 tiers. What was modified were the limits between tier 2 and tier 3, the 300,000 gallons of processed waste per year. So that was kind of a moving target, and they adjusted that number. They also added a limit for tier 4 at 15 million gallons of processed waste per year. So if you exceed that volume, then the general order does not apply to your facility. You would need to apply for individual waste discharge requirements. So if you have a question about your facility and you aren't sure which tier you would fall into, please ask us and we can help provide you with some guidance. Looking through some of the notes here, it tells you what some of the basis is for the gallons of wine produced, or the annual PW produced, based on 5 gallons of wine of processed waste generated per gallon of wine, and then assuming a 2.4 gallon of wine per case equivalent. All right, so reiterating from last time, nothing's really changed here in terms of what the state is concerned about. Primarily, they're looking at waste discharge to land. So they're concerned about excessive BOD loading, biological oxygen demand. So if you're not keeping your wastewater system with good biological health, you can have nuisance odors or anaerobic conditions, and they don't want that. If there's excessive BOD in the waste discharge, you can mobilize trace metals in the soils. They're also concerned about nitrogen levels and nitrate leaching into groundwater. So nitrate levels within winery waste is not a huge concern for the state. However, there is ammonia, there is nitrogen in winery wastewater. So they're concerned with, once that wastewater is discharged to the soil, that it will, through muted again, sorry. Nitrate will potentially leach into the groundwater, and they are, the limit that they've proposed is the same as what is imposed for drinking water, a cap of nitrate MCL of 10 milligrams per liter. So that's their focus on nitrogen. They're also concerned about salinity. It's become a hot topic within the state. Primarily fixed dissolved solids, because the TDS consists of volatile and fixed dissolved solids. Volatile dissolved solids are biodegradable, whereas fixed are the salts, and they're not biodegradable. They'll accumulate in the soil, and they're concerned about the impact of the salts on the soil and the hydraulic conductivity. Second. Okay, so ponds. Every facility has, you either have a ponds, you have a package system, you have a leach field system. And so this general order is going to apply to all of you differently. So for ponds, like last time, it was consistent through the draft and adopted order. They want to understand the sizing of your pond. What is the capacity of your pond? And what is the land application area that's required based on your process waste volume generated? So for existing ponds, they're not as concerned with those for tier 1 and tier 2 facilities needing to meet the new criteria. Those ponds are going to be approved as is from a capacity and liner standpoint, but they are going to keep an eye on groundwater monitoring just to make sure there isn't a degradation happening to groundwater. If there is, then they might impose more restrictions. But to start, for tier 1 and tier 2 facilities that have existing ponds, the requirements are going to be more lenient. For tiers 3 and 4, the state is going to require an evaluation of the liner to make sure it's not, the permeability isn't higher than what's allowed. And they're going to want to make sure that the ponds are sized to meet a set of criteria, mainly the 100-year storm event. So for existing facilities that have existing ponds, we would go through the process of, as part of the enrollment application, to look at the capacity of the ponds and to demonstrate that the liner has, meets the permeability requirements. For new ponds, the state has requirements for tiers 2 through 4 that they're sized to meet a 100-year storm, that they meet the liner requirement prior to construction. One thing that I would like to point out too that I should have on the previous slide is that the states acknowledge that if there are too many facilities that are enrolled or would be categorized as a tier 1 facility and it's in a concentrated area, that they could require or impose you in or move you into the tier 2 category. We don't know what their criteria is going to be, what densely populated means, but that's something to be aware of that will be in communication with the state in regards to. So some additional pond considerations. This order specifically prohibits discharge to a spreading basin, rapid infiltration basin, etc. They're solely looking at wastewater ponds. If you have any of those other types of systems, that will require an individual waste discharge requirement or enrollment specific to your facility. The other thing is the state isn't looking at a wastewater treatment pond any differently, or they're looking at like a holding pond or an equalization pond, just as they would a treatment pond. They're going to impose the same requirements on any type of pond that's holding wastewater or effluent. So here we've outlined some of the pond capacity lining timeline, because I know a lot of you probably have liners that are fairly old and maybe they were originally constructed with clay liners and it's just degraded over time. So if you're looking to add a synthetic liner to your pond, what the state's going to look for is 1 year from the notice of applicability. So you submit your notice of intent, they review, approve it, and issue this notice of applicability. 1 year from when that NOA is provided, that you have a year to prove the capacity and liner of your ponds. And then for new facilities, you have 120 days prior to the start of pond construction and liner installation to get that approved. Within 5 years, facilities need to show that they're meeting the leak testing requirement for existing ponds. And then for all facilities, you have to retest the liner to show that you're meeting the leak testing requirements every 5 years. That can be quite costly. So
it is something to consider when you're looking at your budgets, your operating and maintenance budgets. One other thing that I skipped over was the state is also going to be looking for a demonstration that you have provided 5 feet of separation to a high groundwater table to the bottom of the pond, unless a smaller separation, minimum of 2 feet, is approved, and that'll be done on a case-by-case basis. So from your pond, from your package treatment system, then what happens? You discharge to a land, what they call a land application area. So currently, or what was it based on what was adopted, there is no specific hydraulic limit. And so this was one concession because they used to have a hydraulic limit in there. They're just asking that you are demonstrating that you are providing good irrigation practices. And that's up to the, the engineer, whoever is helping you put together the application to demonstrate. For the land application areas, they're also looking at your biological oxygen demand loading. Previously in the draft order, they were looking at a daily limit for BOD, but they've removed that. And now they're just looking at a cycle average limit of 100 pounds of BOD per acre per day. So this was one concession that they made. They're also looking for you to demonstrate or prove that you're applying nitrogen at agronomic rates, which is going to be dependent on whatever crop it is that you're irrigating. And this will be, we'll be able to demonstrate this through an annual nutrient balance that will be a part of the technical report. So facilities that don't have ponds, they don't have package systems, they're not worried about surface disposal. A lot of facilities have leach field systems, or what the state is referring to as subsurface disposal systems. And this is a hot topic as well, because a lot of facilities have commingled systems. They aren't having to do any pretreatment. And so we'll get into what is going to be required for those facilities. So in general, all subsurface disposal systems are required to have, demonstrate that you have a hydraulic loading limit of 1 gallon per square foot per day. This is kind of getting into, the weeds of things, but this differs pretty heavily from what the local regulatory requirements are, at least for Napa, Sonoma County, and many other county jurisdictions who typically oversee the design criteria for these systems. So that'll be something to look at. And if you have any design information on your existing leach fields, that would be something we would want to confirm, is what is the actual hydraulic loading limit in how the system was designed, and does it meet this new state requirement? Another big item related to SDS systems are the effluent limits. And this specifically applies to tiers 2, 3, and 4. Tier 1 is exempt. Effluent limits that are being imposed are BOD, total nitrogen, and TSS. As of now, those limits have not been imposed on SDS systems. So for winery wastewater systems, from what we've seen in the data we've seen, most facilities are going to exceed those limits without pretreatment. So unless you're doing monitoring to demonstrate that your BOD, total nitrogen, and TSS levels are meet or are lower than those limits, you will likely need to provide pretreatment, some type of pretreatment. And there are lots of options out there, and that's something that Summit can help with, is assessing what type of pretreatment will work best for your system, what would the costs be, the footprint. We help walk our clients through what their options are and what the costs associated are. Another part of the SDS systems that was a concession was that the original draft order said that you had to have 5 feet of separation from the bottom of your leach field trench or your drip line trench to groundwater. And this is a big deal, especially for a lot of facilities in Napa and Sonoma areas where you only need 2 to 3 feet. And so they've added, the state has added a disclaimer that 2 feet could be approved. That's a minimum, but it will again be on a case-by-case basis, and you'll have to provide demonstration for why that should be approved. Another item in the regs that the state speaks to is 100% reserve area needs to be identified. And this isn't anything new. Most county jurisdictions require this as well. What isn't clear in the regulations based on the way it's worded is, are they going to require it to be installed now or just reserved for future use? If it needs to be installed now, that presents some problems because, a lot of these systems are located within the vine rows and there's farming practices, and we don't want you to have to install something that isn't going to be utilized and is possibly going to be damaged from farming practices. So we will advocate for just maintaining that as a truly a reserved area that is just, you can't build in that location, and there are limitations on how you can use that land, but it as long as you're reserving it, that should be sufficient. There are effluent monitoring requirements, which is not typical of SDS systems, that will be required as part of this general order. So that will be a cost consideration for the facility, is just ongoing monitoring. Okay, so commingled systems. A lot of facilities combine their processed wastewater with their domestic wastewater. And this can continue to be allowed for existing and new. This was a big concession because it was not allowed in previous drafts. But processed waste must be pre-treated before you commingle, and the two waste streams are discharged to the subsurface system. That will be a requirement. The other requirement that is a big deal is you will need to demonstrate that 5 feet of groundwater separation standards will be met. They will not allow the reduction up to 2 feet for commingled systems. If you do want to proceed with continuing to utilize your commingled system, the discharger must also submit technical justification that demonstrates that the subsurface disposal area is appropriately sized and designed. This is somewhat vague. They don't give the design criteria. That will likely fall to the engineer to demonstrate, sufficient criteria for that subsurface disposal design. The other thing that they noted for commingled systems is that dual coverage will be required. So you will be required to enroll in the general order as well as have a septic permit through the local authority. So the alternatives to commingling or keeping the waste stream separate, pre-treating processed waste, combining, and then discharging a commingled waste stream is to keep those waste streams separate. And then if you can, divide your subsurface system so that a part of it is dedicated to processed waste and a part of it is dedicated to domestic waste. That will, I think, allow some flexibility in terms of the groundwater separation requirements and just give you more options. A few other concessions in regards to waste discharge setbacks. They reduce the setback for wastewater disposal from 100 to 50 feet to a water supply well and to surface waters or surface water drainage courses. They also reduce the setback to a property line from 50 to 25 feet. And if you can demonstrate that your irrigation system can be managed such that there won't be any runoff and you can keep everything on site, they will allow a reduction of a 5-foot setback to the property line. Salinity. Salinity is a big deal, like I mentioned earlier, and the monitoring of salinity applies to land application areas, so surface disposal as well as subsurface disposal systems. One other item that was a huge topic of discussion was in regards to, we can't, originally they said you could not discharge water softener, RO backwash, boiler blowdown, but they've since modified, and what was adopted is they're only prohibiting the discharge of water softener backwash into process waste system or to land discharge. RO backwash and boiler blowdown is allowed. What they're looking for there is they don't want any additive salt systems or additive salts to be added to the process waste stream. They will allow any processes that are just removing salts from the water sources. So how are they imposing these salinity requirements? What the state's looking for are the fixed dissolved solid levels. And what they've outlined is that you're meeting the threshold. So what is the source water FDS levels or the salt level in the source water, your well water, plus 320 milligrams per liter? Does your effluent meet that threshold? If not, they will require a salt control plan that you will need to implement in terms of source control or other measures to demonstrate how are you going to be able to meet that threshold. So what does this require? Well, you're going to need to demonstrate that what the FDS levels are and TDS levels are in your source water, because currently you're likely not monitoring that. So my recommendation would be to get a good handle on what those levels are in your well water so that you know where you stand in terms of meeting that threshold or not. Additionally, like I mentioned, the exceedance of that threshold triggers a salt control plan. If you are involved with a sustainability program or the CV salts program, there could be some concessions in terms of what salinity requirements you need to meet. Monitoring updates. So a big part of this general order is there is a lot of monitoring that's required. So this is time consuming. It's a huge expense for facilities. So it's something that you should be aware of and plan on, as it will impact your budgets. Overall, some general sampling and monitoring requirements are winery effluent. So before it goes to treatment for facilities that fall in the tiers 2 to 4 categories, all new, will have to, there are effluent monitoring requirements, a number of constituents you'll need to test for. For tier 1, you don't need to do that effluent monitoring, you only need to monitor flow. Pond monitoring is required for tiers 2 to 4 facilities. Land application monitoring is required for tiers 2 to 4. So what are you discharging to land? The effluent, or what's being sent to subsurface disposal systems, for tiers 2 to 4, and solids monitoring. So there are a lot of different points in your waste stream that are now going to be required as far as sampling and monitoring goes. Similarly, just separate from the waste stream, there is going to be groundwater monitoring requirements. And this applies to pond systems, land application area, and subsurface disposal systems. If this mainly applies to tier 4. Tier 4 groundwater monitoring is required. There are some exemptions, which we'll talk about later, but it is typically going to be required. Tier 3 facilities will be at the board's discretion. So if there's something demonstrating degradation to groundwater, those facilities will likely be required to do groundwater monitoring. There's also reporting requirements outlined in the adopted order. So for facilities, if your flows exceed what you're allowed, you have an effluent limit that you're exceeding or a discharge limit you're exceeding, you must issue a compliance letter the month following that exceedance for any tier. Semi-annual reports will be required for tier 4, and then annual reports are required for tiers 1 through 4. So for some jurisdictions, this will be less reporting. I know Napa requires monthly, and then for others, it'll be a little bit more involved. So again, we can talk about specific requirements for your facility once we know which tier you fall into. Local agency updates, and I apologize for facilities that are outside of these jurisdictions. We're very in tune with what's happening in Napa, Sonoma County, because they've been heavily involved with this general order. So for Napa County, as facilities know that are in Napa, they oversee all of the winery waste discharge facilities, unless they're a substantially large facility, and then they may have deferred to the state. Napa County still intends to be a local authority and oversee this general order for the wineries within their county. What needs to happen in order to do that? Because they're not currently approved to be the local authority. I spoke with Kim Withrow the other day. They need to update their code language to refer to the general order for winery systems and what the code requirements are. And they have some other just general updates for their conventional systems. So they need to update code language, and they need to develop another MOU with the state, because the one they have now is outdated, doesn't reference the general order. And so the county is going to be working on that, and they'd like to have something adopted by the end of the year. Until that happens, the state is the governing entity over over your facility, unless you have an existing permit in place. If you have an existing permit in place, that permit will govern until it expires. It's when you get to the point where you need to renew it is where we'll need to figure out, okay, is Napa County now a local authority, or is the state still the local, or the state still the authority? One thing that Kim did point out is they want to get stakeholder input. They're assuming that that facilities in Napa want them to continue to oversee their systems, but they want to make sure that they're getting stakeholder input. So be on the lookout for outreach from the county if you are in Napa. Separately, Sonoma County. Sonoma County wants to have nothing to do with winery wastewater disposal, so they have deferred to the state. One issue that we still need to work out and understand how the state is going to enforce this is if they are going to allow hold and haul. Most other jurisdictions allow hold and haul. The general order allows hold and haul as an option. Sonoma County And the basin plan for our North Coast does not, there's language in there that prohibits hold and haul. And so we really need to sort that out, because I know that some facilities are looking at that as a more economical option. So stay tuned, but as of now, it's not allowed. Timeline. So as I mentioned before, the order was adopted on the 20th. So if you are an existing facility and you don't have any waste discharge requirements, then within 3 years, you need to submit an NOI and technical report to the state. And then the technical report must demonstrate how you will be in compliance within 5 years of receiving the notice of applicability from the state. If you have an existing waste discharge requirement or a conditional waiver, you don't need to do anything right now. Technically, if you wanted to, you could. Maybe you're governed by the Central Valley and you have an individual waste discharge order that's more stringent than the general order, and you want to enroll in the general order. You can submit now, but you don't have to. You do not need to submit an NOI or technical report until your permit or waste discharge requirement expires. Once you submit, then or your technical report that you submit must also address the compliance schedule within 5 years of notice of applicability. So the same applies. A new winery facility, the only requirement for an application or notice of intent submittal is that it be submitted 180 days before operation. Compliance schedule. So this kind of outlines the process and what will be required within a certain time, kind of taking things a step further. So you submit your NOI. The state technically has 180 days to respond before you are administratively approved. Existing facilities that receive an NOA, once you receive it, the state will acknowledge your tier determination, your monitoring and reporting requirements, and then hopefully an approved timeline for compliance, proving what you have requested. You receive the NOA. Within 90 days, you need to provide and demonstrate that you're providing good housekeeping practices, you're diverting your brine, and you need to be implementing your monitoring and sampling upgrades. Within 180 days, you need to be demonstrating that you're diverting solids, you've replaced sodium as practical as possible, and you're reducing chemicals. For tiers 3 to 4, you also need to prepare a spill prevention plan, and tiers 4, you need to be working on your monitoring well installation work plan. Within 2 years for tiers 2, 3, and 4, complete system changes to be compliant with daily discharge flow limit. Within 3 years, existing commingled systems, you need to obtain separate coverage or modify the system to be compliant with the general order. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide, but this is a resource that we'll be sending out to everybody as a flow chart to kind of make this process less complicated, because there are a lot of nuances and if this, then this parts about this general order. So this flow chart we'll provide it to you so that we can help kind of walk you through the process. You know, what makes you exempt? What are your flows? If your flows are 30,000 to 300,000 gallons, what does that mean for my facility in terms of monitoring, reporting? So hopefully this will be a useful tool for all of you, and we will share that shortly after this presentation. With that, I'm sure that there are lots of questions. And so if you do have questions, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to facilitate that discussion, and then he and I will answer them together.
All right, thanks, Gina. What I'm going to try to do here, we've had some questions coming in throughout the presentation. I've been keeping track of those. So what I'm going to try to do here is have people come off of mute so they can ask their questions directly, and we can get a little bit more back and forth that way. So the first question was from Chaz about compliance. And Chaz, I'm going to try to unmute you right now.
Hi, thanks, Jason. So what I was asking was, the first slide said that you've got 3 years to put your NOI in and then another 5 years to do your NOA. So does that mean that from when you actually do your waste requirements, you've got a total of 8 years to be compliant? Or does the 3 years and 5 years run concurrently and you've only got 5 years to do that?
Yes, so Chaz, you're right. You have up to eight years total to be fully compliant. There are going to be little nuances, potentially from the 3 to 8 year mark. So it's not going to be, you have to have everything done by 8 years. They may have staggered things that you need to start incorporating within that 3 to 8 year timeline.
All right. And then Carl had a couple questions as well. So Carl, I'm gonna unmute you here and let you reiterate those. Okay, it looks like I'm having trouble unmuting him, so I'm just going to read his question. First question was, what will be involved in demonstrating actual depth to groundwater?
Well, that's a really good question. What will be involved? If the facility already has monitoring wells on site, a lot of on-site or subsurface disposal systems, they do have monitoring wells, or a lot of facilities have monitoring wells in their land discharge area already. That is going to be one way. Another way will be if you have representative soil borings from a geotechnical report. Ultimately, because monitoring is going to be required for the larger facilities, if there's a way to start developing the monitoring well network now, that will be another alternative to being able to look at what the actual groundwater elevations are at your land disposal area, your near your ponds, or near your subsurface disposal area. So there are going to be options.
Okay, and then a second question from Carl is with respect to solids monitoring. Does this apply to grape solids? And if so, what are the monitoring requirements?
Yeah, so part of the general order is tracking POMIS and what's stored on site, what's hauled off site, and the amount of solids generated in terms of POMIS. It'll also reflect, for ponds specifically, any dredging or sludge removal from your ponds, you'll need to report that as well.
All right, this one's a little bit longer, and somebody is in a position where they can't talk, so I'm going to read this one out. Working at a 30-year-old facility, I've been hearing that some people may be required to line their ponds. For his facility, pond 1 is concrete, pond 2 is clay-based, and pond 3 is none of the above. What, if anything, allows you to be grandfathered / exempt from pond liner requirements?
So the only thing that would allow a facility to be exempt is, one, if your categorization is that you're a tier 1 or tier 2 facility. If you are in tier 3 or tier 4, you will need to demonstrate the details of design for when those liners were either constructed, or to do a subsequent test showing that the liner meets whatever type of liner, concrete, soil, synthetic, meets the requirements of the state. So if you're a tier 3 or tier 4 facility, you will not be grandfathered in from a liner requirement standpoint, but you can demonstrate compliance through testing or design documents that you meet the requirements.
Okay. And then another question is, was there anything in the revised general order about cooling tower discharge, cooling tower drainage, or blowdown?
Yes, the only modification was that you can continue to send cooling tower discharge to your process waste system, because it's not an additive salt to the process waste stream. And that before we go to another question, that kind of reminds me, for facilities that have package treatment systems or even a pond system, and you're discharging to a municipality, as long as you're not discharging the treated wastewater to land, you do not need to enroll in this general order. You will be exempt.
All right, and then one more question. You hit on this a little bit, but I think there's probably confusion all around. This facility just had their pond inspection, and Napa County wasn't sure if they will be the authority or have any authority to basically enroll people in this general order. Just kind of reiterate where they're at in conversations with the state and what the next steps are for them to have some authority on this.
Yeah, so currently, if you're permitted in Napa County, that permit is valid until it expires. As far as I know, and talking with Kim Withrow at Napa County, they have every intent of continuing to provide oversight for Napa County facilities, but they need to do a few things in order to be able to continue to have that authority. They need to get an MOU with the state and adopt their regulations that have been in draft form for a few years now. So yes, they have every intention of overseeing facilities. But until then, you just have to hang tight, stay with your existing permit. And if it does expire and they don't have those MOUs in place or that MOU in place, then we should talk, because we'll need to figure out what the process is. It would likely be that you apply under the general order and temporarily the state has oversight. I do want to say, I mean, the state's not going to have the manpower. They don't currently have the manpower to enforce the general order. They need Napa County's help in order to help implement these regulations.
Okay, this question is with respect to determination of the tier structure. And the question is whether the assumption of 5 gallons of processed wastewater per gallon of wine produced, did that change from 6 in the previous version down to 5 in the current version?
So this facilities, depending on your size, that generation rate can range. I've seen it range anywhere from 2 to 10. There are industry standards that we follow based on facility sizing. But if you have historical wastewater generation records, that's going to be better than anything, because we can calculate what that generation rate actually is. If you don't, we will talk with the winemaker and your team to understand what are the processes in your facility. Are you crushing on site? Are you only bottling? And then we use criteria that for the industry to apply for your facility specifically. The state doesn't have mandated requirements on what that generation rate is. They just ask that you're using sound judgment and an appropriate basis.
Okay, the next question's for a tier 4 facility that's looking to avoid installing groundwater monitoring wells if they can. And the question is, if they don't want to install those groundwater monitoring wells, what other options do they have?
So the order specifically outlines what you need to have in place in order to request an exemption. And so if you want to request an exemption, you would do that as part of your notice of intent technical report. So if you have a pond system, the pond has to be less than 1 million gallons. Groundwater levels need to be demonstrated that they're at least 25 feet below ground surface. Napa Valley, that's going to be really difficult. You also need to demonstrate that the nearest surface water body is at least half a mile from your land application area, and that the nearest drinking water well is located at least a half a mile from your land application area. So a lot of facilities are not going to be able to meet those requirements from what I've seen, but they do have the exemption criteria written into the code language if you do meet that criteria.
Okay, this is a follow-up question on the tier limits. And the question is whether or not those tier limits that you had up during the presentation are set in stone, or if there's any opportunity to get some mitigation based on cost associated with compliance. So
this was a pretty in-depth conversation during the recent public hearing before it was adopted. And what the state decided was that, costs were not a concern. They were more concerned with the threat to groundwater quality. And they felt like any additional discussion or information wouldn't necessarily sway them to modify those tier limits, because regardless of where that needle lies, that, people weren't going to be happy on one side or the other. And so they decided to stick with the tier limits as is, adopt the order. However, the Wine Institute and staff were going to work together to look at risk factors in regards to the tier 4 facilities and the associated groundwater monitoring. So they could amend it, but there weren't any promises, because they didn't feel like that there would be enough information or data to support them to want to move that needle.
Okay, this is another question about the tier limits. And the question is, if a facility oscillates between two different tiers from year to year, how do they classify which one they'll be categorized in?
Okay. Before I answer that, one thing that just popped into mind is that a lot of facilities are used to designing a wastewater system to meet their entitled production capacity. One benefit of the general order is that they do not require you to demonstrate or install a system to meet that entitled production or the wastewater generated from that entitled production. If you want to go in with a phase 1 limited production, or you can demonstrate that you're going to be operating at half your entitled production capacity, you can demonstrate that your wastewater system is sized to handle half of that flow. So that is one potential benefit, I think, to the general order. With that said, when you go in and apply to the general order, you know, we want to have a discussion about these are the anticipated production volumes, not just for now, but maybe for the next 5 years, so that you're not having to reapply, especially if you oscillate between the two different, you know, a couple of different tier levels. You want to apply and be enrolled for a while so you don't have to go through this process, you know, over and over again. So with that said, if you're kind of on the brink of one of the tiers, or you're going to oscillate, the state is likely going to require you just to go into the higher tier. If you go in low, say with tier 3 numbers, and your monitoring reports demonstrate that you're often higher than tier 3, then they'll require you to automatically enroll in tier 4 and provide all of the necessary you know, monitoring wells and reporting and other sampling required for that tier. So we just have to sit down, talk about it, and make a judgment call for what makes the most sense.
Okay, this one's related to fees, and I know you mentioned that there's still some to be determined information on fees, but the question is, what are the fees going to be based on, and when do we expect the fees to start?
So the fees are going to be based on which tier you fall into and your threat to groundwater quality. Do you have a liner? Do you not? So they're going to be looking at a variety of factors to determine your threat to groundwater quality, and they'll have a table, and it will tell you what the fee is going to be. And then those fees, you'll pay an initial filing fee when you submit your notice of intent and technical report to the state. And then that fee will apply for the first year, and then it will need to be renewed on an annual basis.
Okay, and then there's a question about facilities that have packaged systems or pre-treatment systems, something like a membrane bioreactor. And the question is, how does the general order affect those facilities and treatment equipment?
So those facilities won't need to, it's not like a pond where you need to do groundwater monitoring around the package system, but you will still need to be in compliance with the land application or waste discharge requirements. So if you're taking the effluent from your package system and applying it to vineyard, applying it to an olive orchard, wherever, you will need to demonstrate compliance with groundwater monitoring and any other land application area requirements. In addition, you'll need to do groundwater monitoring if you're tier 4, and the solids monitoring, like all other facilities.
Okay, this one has to do with stormwater management. And so at this facility, they divert all of their both processed wastewater and stormwater to a wastewater pond. Obviously, the stormwater increases the total water volume that's being read on the wastewater meter and impacts the tier determination. So are there any suggestions for how to split out the stormwater so that it doesn't push them into a higher tier?
Yes, but that would require us to look, you know, we'd want to look at the topography of the site and the grading to understand, are there ways to isolate stormwater? If you will not be allowed to divert any processing areas that are uncovered. Unfortunately, all of that will need to be accounted for and sent and continued to be sent to the process waste system. But if you have any other outdoor any other outdoor areas that are collecting storm, and there's a way to isolate those areas and keep it separate from process waste, that can be done. And that's just an engineering exercise that we could definitely help out with.
Okay, I think we've answered all the questions that have come in so far. We do have about 5 minutes left. So if anybody has anything else they want to address, feel free to type it in or raise your hand and we can pull you in. Obviously, outside of this meeting, as you have facility specific questions, you can get in touch with any of us and we can absolutely look into your specific situation in a little bit more detail. Go ahead, Gina.
And just to reiterate what Jason's saying, we've been working really closely with the Wine Institute, the regulators that have put together the order. And so I have their direct phone line and I call them with questions all the time. They don't always have the answers, but the fact that we can reach them and talk through some of these questions, I think is important. And so if you do have a question and it's not clear in the code of how the state will look at your scenario, by all means, contact us, let me know, and I can talk to the right person.
Okay, answering a few more questions that are coming in here. Yes, there will be a copy of the presentation available to everybody. And then there's a request, Gina, to expand a little bit more on the stormwater diversion. So obviously stormwater diversion has lots of pieces to it, but maybe just speak a little bit more to the original question about how to split it out from the PW.
Yeah, so like I was saying, you will not be able to split out any uncovered processing areas that collect storms sometimes of the year and collect process waste during harvest activities. All of that stormwater will have to continue to go to the wastewater system unless you cover it and you can, reduce the volume of stormwater that goes to the process waste system. Otherwise, if we can look at your site layout and the topography, we can figure out, are there any spaces that are collecting stormwater unnecessarily and sending it to the pond? That can be, it can be costly if you have to adjust grading so that you're redirecting storm runoff. But it is possible, and it's just going to depend on how each facility is laid out and how easy it would be to change the direction and collection of stormwater.
All right. I think we're all caught up with the questions. Gina, if you have any kind of closing thoughts, we're at about 1 o'clock here.
Awesome. So again, thanks to everybody for attending. Hope it was informative. There's a lot of information to cover. So trying to be as concise as possible, but as always, if you have questions, pick up the phone, email me, we'll respond as to what the impacts are specifically for you. We want to help make this process as easy as possible. You guys have other things to worry about, so let us worry about your wastewater. We'll help you out. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.